Hello, Rachel. Thanks for joining me.
Hi Emma, hello, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. So let's start by getting to know you a bit in terms of your Quaker journey. So can you think back and tell us about your journey into Quakers? What were you seeking and what did you find?
Are you assuming that I started off outside Quakers, but I was brought up Quaker? I always find it interesting when people assume that people have moved into Quakers from something else. This is just where I'm from. I attended a small meeting with my parents and siblings from when I was very young. We were uh, most of the children's meeting, as I recall, and in a meeting that got maybe, I don't know, be at that point probably about 10 people on a Sunday. So this was yeah, it's a small close-ish knit Quaker community. The children's group grew. We were very fortunate. We had a number of families. We had quite a lot of family activities going on. And then I did a lot of Quaker teenage stuff when I was a teenager. What are now, well, basically link groups. So Midlands link group and national Quaker teenage activities, JYM, all this kind of thing, and kind of just kept going. I think that I think that I was I it was home. I felt very much at home. I think that I know that the Quaker teenage and Quaker kid stuff was where I felt like I could be myself. When at school I couldn't. I thought this was. I made friendships there that were extremely important to me. I had national networks of friendships, and I really, really like silent worship. And you grow into it. Obviously, when you're a kid, you're not in all that much. You're not in silence all that much, but it worked for me. And I, it because I was pretty convinced from as early as I could remember that God was real. I mean, I don't remember asking myself if I believed in God. God was just there, So that was just a thing. That was just always there. So in a way, well, this is the space I do God. This is the and yeah. So in a way, that's rather uninteresting. That I carried on. I've just carried on doing Quaker stuff. I'm afraid. And sorry, did you want
Yeah,
another question on
so
that?
yeah, did you not ever look elsewhere then?
Oh
You
goodness, yeah, of course I did. Because I mean, of course, the other major part of all of this is that at some point, almost by accident, I decided that I was going to go to university and study theology and religious studies rather than any other thing one could pick. Well, I mean, I'd enjoyed religious studies at school, but actually, mostly I picked the subject because it lets you do a bit of everything, and I'm intellectually indecisive and interested in absolutely everything. And best kept secret is it's the most diverse arts and humanities degree course that's going. So I actually just picked it for intellectual interest. But obviously, as soon as you're studying religious theology and religious studies, and you're a member of a tiny little religious community, you are spending the vast majority of your time studying everybody else's ways of doing religion. And particularly if, as I increasingly was during my university studies, what you're really actually interested in is Christian theology. Uh, you are very explicitly spending most of your time reading people who think that you're wrong and who you think are wrong. Not about everything, but about a few relatively significant things. Um, it has it very rarely struck me while I was studying, and it's actually been remarkably infrequently been a deal since that might be an odd thing to do. So I mostly operate with it. So that's what I've carried on doing. Right, I teach and write about Christian theology for a living. That's what I've been lucky enough to end up doing. Um, I now because I have the freedom to research and teach and write what I feel like. I now do some Quaker stuff in with that, but it's still a tiny minority voice in the great tradition. So it's not most of what I spend time with intellectually, nor of course personally, because most my academic colleagues, my friends, my intellectual community are mostly not Quakers, and so I reasons that I might, I occasionally think that goodness, I can't really deal with Quakers anymore, but nobody else does silent unprogrammed worship. You see, this is the thing, we've kind of cornered the market, and if I when I which I very frequently do and have done for years and years, go to worship in any other Christian tradition, I tend to end up thinking that was great, and now I want to go to meeting for worship as well. Um, because there's something actually quite deep about I guess spiritual formation, which is embodied and habitual as well, right? It's not actually about what you're persuaded of in your head. It's about what works for you on every level,
Mm.
spiritual level and emotional level, what connects you, what centers you, what grounds you, and I mean, obviously, plenty of folk do swap that out or swap that around or get used to something else or have to get used to something else. Um, but at the point where I don't have to, I don't choose to, if you see what I mean, because in the end the meeting is absolutely the Quaker meeting for worship is absolutely central. Lots of other things about Quakers are extremely important to me, and you realise as you uh, I suppose different things come to the fore as you get older. I figured out quite early on that I had a most extraordinary gift and stroke of luck by growing up within a religious community where it was just assumed that women did everything that men could do. Women lead, women preach, women teach. Um, I remember very clearly going to an ecumenical conference when I was in my early 20s, I guess, Churches Together in Britain and Ireland conference, which point I was on Meeting for Sufferings. I was Young First General Meeting representative on Meeting for Sufferings. And you're in these discussion groups or whatever, and they're all about everybody. An ecumenical conference is normally pretty progressive, so they're all about how this, that, or the other needs to change in the churches. And then they look at me and they say, "Oh, it's your generation because you're young and you're outside all the structures of power, and you can be radical." And I'm sitting there going, "I'm actually on the national decision-making body of my church," but you assumed perfectly reasonably that because I'm a young woman without a dog collar on or whatever, I hold no power or no responsibility. But that wasn't the case, and it wasn't. And the other thing was that wasn't exceptional, like because that's just how Quakers do stuff, and that's just what I had grown up taking for granted. And to grow up taking that for granted, um, in religious communities is really quite rare. Um, and then to be able to turn around and go, well, actually, one way and another, and okay, there's all sorts of complexities, but one way or another, we've kind of been doing that since the 17th century is also quite a big deal. um,
Mm.
but
Mm.
in a way, if you weren't staying, I suppose what I find hard to understand, although I realise that it's some people's experience, so I wouldn't argue with it, is um, liking the main thing you like about Quakers not being Quaker worship, because I sort of tend to think anything else you get from Quakers you can get elsewhere. Um, but,
Mm.
but this is the thing we do. On the other hand, what do I know? That's um, coming from my experience and what matters to me.
Mm.
Um, I mean, things that might possibly have made me leave with basically at the whole point when I thought Quakers don't want Christians. They just don't want Christians. They'd really rather we all went away. But that still comes up from time to time, right? But actually, I I am not minded, especially looking at the body of Quakers across time and space, to as it were, give up that particular bit of ground.
Mm.
I kind of think, well, if you can't cope with Christian Quakers, then you can't cope with most of the Quakers there's ever been.
Mm.
So, you know,
And
not
still
saying
are.
you're not saying
Still
and still out and still are absolutely. So like not saying nobody, absolute golden rule of Quakers, nobody is to be made to say they believe something they don't believe. That's rule number one and all the way down. So you don't believe it, you don't believe it. That's your business. But at the same time, the sense that I have problems with attempts to define Quakers by exclusion, by what you're not, by what they're not, by attempts to define Quakers by not doing or not believing certain things, particularly things that other churches might do. So, but I mean, in terms of contemporary Quakers, what I'm really contemporary Quakers in Britain, what I'm really kind of committed to and excited about is actually is real theological diversity and spiritual diversity. It just has to be real diversity, and not uh, um, not not sort of all the new whizzy stuff and not the old stuff. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
but that's I mean, but then it's also about sort of recognizing your own particular place within things. So something I've learned from being on the Book of Discipline revision committee, that where you learn things that you assume that other people don't, is that I learned that I assume that dead Quakers matter really quite a lot. I mean, I care really quite a lot about the dead Quakers. I spend quite a lot of time with the dead Quakers. I sort of think that when it comes to representing Quakers and what Quakers do, they're extremely important and they need to be listened to. But then I realised, well, that's actually not a particularly kind of deep spiritual commitment. That's mostly professional training. That's mostly because I
Mm.
spend most of my time thinking and caring about what dead people think. So to that extent, one can recognise that one's got one's own sort of weird little set of stuff to do, and it all kind of contributes to the greater whole. But the dead Quakers are, I mean, some of the dead Quakers are absolutely amazing. And, why wouldn't you want to spend more
Mm.
time hanging out with them?
So, so how do you describe, if you do, but if you think about yourself first of all,
Yeah,
because obviously you've got the language, the Christian language and the theological language to be
yeah,
able to explain it well. So how do you see yourself? Do you call yourself Christian? And
yeah, of
what do you
course.
mean by that?
Of course, I call myself Christian. I believe that God is as God is revealed in Jesus Christ. I believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. And I believe that's the indication of the future of the world and creation. And I believe that shows what the love of God means. I mean, and most simply, I believe God loves everyone the way that Jesus loves. And that's a huge deal. Um, and that's kind of what defines my kind of core understanding of God. And all of that makes total sense as a Quaker. It makes all the sense as a Quaker. Um, and that is the God that what needs to meet you for worship, and this is the exciting thing. This is the thing Quakers got absolutely right, and it's really really hard to get anybody else to really show what it means to them. That's the God that changes things in real time. That actually guides and empowers you to do stuff now. That's so exciting. Um, it is. I am. I mean, I'm mostly right about that. I'm mostly right about the Holy Spirit. At this at the moment, I'm mostly right about the Holy Spirit. So I'm mostly right about what it means to talk about God as empowering and as guiding, and that is it's basic Christian belief, right?
Mm.
But it's also basic Quaker belief, and it's also basic Quaker belief because that's where the Quakers come from. Um, so I mean, some of the stuff that I said there, I don't think there's quite a lot of Quakers in Britain that don't believe a word of it. Um,
So,
I think that
yeah, I was going to say, so let me just ask a bit more of what you said there. So I really like the
yeah,
way you say that is the God that we meet in meeting for worship.
yeah.
And I just wondered if you can say any more about that, about how you feel. you experience that. And if somebody said, well, I've that's never happened to me, what am I looking for? How do
Mm.
you try to convey that?
I mean, then you're talking about, I suppose, describing experiences which is different from sort of that's different from explaining. I mean, the two go quite closely together. But
Well,
sorry,
the thing is,
I mean,
I
I'm
remember
actually
an
going to get
Orth
this wrong because
I
yeah,
remember an
I'm just
Orthodox
I'm
priest I
trying to get
spoke
a
to
hand of
once.
what you're asking.
And I became friendly with. And he said, because he was a great theologian, and he wrote lots of books, and because he was Orthodox, he would go to Mount Athos to the monastery there.
Mm,
And he said the old monks there would really be quite hard on him, and they'd say, well, we know that you know about God, we kind of in
mm,
terms of you can write about God, but what do you know of him?
mm, mm,
How do
mm,
you experience God?
mm,
Do you
mm,
know
mm,
God?
mm,
And I suppose that's part of what I'm trying to understand
mm,
is when people like well, I think I speak like that as well, in that I believe meeting for worship is about having a direct experience of God and
mm, mm,
feeling the loving, peaceful presence of God,
mm, mm,
and that
mm,
that's a
mm,
transformative experience.
mm,
And
mm.
without that, I don't quite know how you live a spiritual life. So I
Mm.
see it as quite foundational. And
Well, kind of that then, I suppose. I mean, if that's what yeah, sorry, I was genuinely not understanding the question. I mean, what you just said is what you just said. I, I mean, I think I'd add clarity. I think I'd add something about clarity or something about understanding
Mm,
in there, or something about changing the way you see things. So there's about feeling loving, peaceful presence. So that's about being held, uh, being loved, being strengthened is the word I'm looking for. But I think I'd also put something about seeing things another way, seeing things with love, seeing possibilities that you don't otherwise see, seeing the world differently, um, seeing what matters. So there's something about discerning priorities, yeah,
mm,
um, and yeah, and also being connected with other people. So does meeting for worship as a collective experience. So being together in the presence of God, right? And being gathered, which is, I mean, so the idea of the gathered meeting. That and the real sense that that's not something that people do for themselves as such. You turn up and kind of hope to be gathered, right? So you gather in the sense that you show, you choose to come and you choose to put yourself there. Um, but it can start off very disparate, very fragmentary, both contents of your own head, because being one person isn't being one thing, right? That's also being scattered, right? You can be internally scattered, and you can become internally gathered, individually gathered, and you can become gathered as a meeting.
mm.
And yeah, and I mean all of those experiences. So you've got a light type experiences, you've got clarity, illumination, understanding things differently, seeing things differently. Um, you've got a love type experience, if you like, which is being held, being gathered, being and then there's a life type experience, which is about strength of um, sense of direction, ability to keep on keeping on, right? Sense of what you've got to do.
Yeah,
um, yeah.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, all of those. And that's, I mean, I can find traces of all of that in early Quaker text and well beyond Quaker text, right? It's a thing that you recognise, probably the thing that your Mount Athos guy would
Mm.
also recognise, would also pick up. But
Do you find meeting for worship easy?
I don't know. It depends, doesn't it?
I'm thinking
I
about
mean,
the
it's just a
settling
thing you
down,
do.
the centering down, getting there, getting yourself into that, into the right heart and mind prepared.
I think it's just a thing you do. I suppose I don't expect too much of myself. I just show up. Um, I, because of course the wonderful thing is it's there, you know, and it'll still be there next week. Right, this week doesn't work, it's still there next week. Um, you know, um, what I mean, one can. That's not about being completely casual and laid back, but um, I I don't actually. I think it's like trying to go to sleep, isn't it? Right. The trick is just not to worry about it. Um, the trick is to go. Well, okay, here I am. You know, this is just where I am. This is what I do. Um, let's see what happens. I mean, it is the open character of it, the experimental character of meeting for worship, which that's part of the fun, isn't it? It's just it's open. It's a door opening. Um, I don't even you don't if you don't have a sense of exactly a definite goal, right? You have an intention to be there and to be open to what happens. Like that's
Hmm.
the core of it.
And because of course you've grown up with this, you've had a huge amount of input, perhaps as a child and teenager and young person.
Yeah.
Do you think at all about the spiritual formation process of parents and teachers and whoever else in how you try to give young people this experience? And of course, many people come to join us in later life as well, so it's not just age related. Newcomers, do you get any sense of how we can provide the right setting and the right
Yeah,
condition?
I mean, I do think about this quite a lot, of course, because I've got children of my own, and I also help with children's meeting at our meeting. That's something I started doing once my kids were grown, because well, you don't want to do that as a parent. You want, you need a break. Um, uh, I mean, one of the interesting things that I think about, and my husband said the same to me when talking about experiences growing up as Quaker kids, is that we both remember more or less nothing that we actually did in children's meetings, in children's classes. But we have very, very, very strong memories of the community and the people, and there are individuals, and you remember what they look like, and you remember the kinds of things they said, and you remember how they were. Um, and so I actually think that the first and most important thing is making meeting communities places where children feel at home, feel they're welcome, feel they're part of the community, feel that there is more than their parents that are bothered about them, um, as people, which is not as kind of future Quakers, if you like, but as the people that we've got now and the people that we're interacting with now. Um, and actually people's lives do speak. You learn a lot from being around the people, because being around people who um, living as Quakers and doing their thing. Now, I that would be a really lazy and a complete cop out if you only did that, because clearly there must have been quite a lot that actually stuck in my head. I just couldn't now put my finger on it. I have a big thing about telling stories and trying to make a point of telling Quaker stories, um, and sharing as in stories about contemporary and past Quakers and the ways that they live out their faith, and that as a really important and a key way of learning, um, and not actually being. I mean, I also have a thing about not being scared about telling stories you can't explain the whole of, because then they stick in people's heads, and you think about them, you come back to them later. I also have quite a big thing about sort of open response to opening big questions and letting children respond to them. So not, you're not afraid to talk about God with children, not being afraid to ask about silence with children and think about, to spend time in quiet, to say this is all right. You can you have questions without answers are all right. You know,
Mm.
stories without where you're not quite sure whether the ending is sad or happy are all right. Uh, uh, um, Part of so that's a lot of that is about forming a spiritual attitude, really, isn't it? And an attitude that can live with real confidence, with openness, or with uncertainty in the sense of I'm not really quite sure how this all fits together, but I know it's all real. Um,
Mm.
that kind of uncertainty, the sort of unfinishedness of real life, right?
Yeah.
Many more things are real than I know how to put together. Um, and I think there's ways of being with children and encouraging children to be that you can do that. Just even simple stuff like hearing and acknowledging what's the different things that are going on in people's lives. So there's actually so it's that what I'm quite I suppose what I'm talking myself around to is the idea that I think Quaker children's work, young people's work, a lot of what it does is finding what it does really well is finding an age appropriate way of doing Quaker spirituality rather than a teaching about and this is how
Mm.
so learning by doing,
Yeah.
which includes the silence, but it includes the things that are silence adjacent, like so careful listening to everybody,
Yeah. Yeah.
holding differences, uh, reflecting on conflicts rather than acting them out, this kind of thing. And there's lots and lots of just basic practices um, that could be quite formational. And then the great thing then is that, well, if your kids decide that they don't want to hang out at Quaker meetings, which, let's face it, only a tiny minority of people do. you know, Chances are your Quaker kids are not going to grow up to want to be Quakers, but they still had all these really important experiences when they were kids, which will
Mm.
help them when they're adults. Right? We don't do children and youth work in order to make more Quakers. We do it because we think we've got something that everybody, whatever age they are, can get something can gain
Yeah.
from.
Yeah.
That's
And I love that phrase, silence adjacent. I haven't heard anybody else use that phrase, so I don't know.
I just invented it. So
It's great because one of the things that because I go into prisons and I basically do chaplaincy and do try to do silent worship, even if very briefly, or silence adjacent activities with men, in my case, who have no idea what that's all about. So I'm very used to this idea of trying to do activities and do a time together, which
yeah,
isn't teaching about. We hardly ever
mm,
talk about what Quakers
mm,
are. We don't even sometimes mention Quakers.
no,
But we're doing,
yeah.
and I suppose
This is
I really
yeah,
do use my own personality as much
yeah,
as anything. I'm just
yeah,
there, I'm
yeah,
showing up and I'm guiding the process.
yeah,
And one of the things I'm interested in is why don't we do more of that with all of our age community, not just the young people, not just the new people, but how I'm thinking about people who, fidget a lot and can't sit still, people with ADHD or something like that, can't focus. Lots of people tell me that they really struggle with the silence because in the silence, all of these dark thoughts come up and they don't know how to deal with that then, especially in a group of people. And that's the thing that would stop them from coming to a Quaker meeting.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
that's why one of the things that I've started to kind of develop this is idea of a guided Quaker worship
mm,
experience where I'm I'm almost just using
yeah,
my voice and my presence and maybe in advices and queries
mm,
as a thread through the process so
yeah,
it keeps people on the journey together.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. No, I think that no, that's great, and I mean I mean that's quite a common way of thinking about what gets labelled as all age worship, and I don't particularly like because I'm like it doesn't have an 18 certificate on the door in the normal way of things, right? Anyone who
yeah,
wants to come in can come in, but semi-programmed worship specifically aimed at making sure children feel included, right? So, AKA all age worship, often, well, I think when for the best ways of doing it, and precisely the sort of way you've said, is saying, well, this is a Quaker meeting for worship, so it kind of does all that stuff. It's just probably going to be a bit less quiet and a bit, and there's more structure, more scaffolding, as we'd say in education, right? There's more of a scaffolding, if you want it, which is the point about scaffolding in education, right? Because you could take it away.
Exactly. I mean,
um, yeah,
scaffolding is the word I use, and I
yeah,
think that's
yeah,
what I'm trying to do. And I do notice that there's a little bit of resistance sometimes. And I've been using the phrase semi-programmed meeting, and I've been using that for the last 10, 20 years, and
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
don't really
exactly,
get
yeah,
much interest or don't get much take up,
yeah,
get quite a
yeah.
bit of pushback against it, really.
Well, at a certain point, I do feel that some of this stuff is a matter of taste, not in a trivial way. But there are people who just really like silent worship and people who don't, and that's kind of okay. You
Mm.
know, people are different. Newsflash. So I could completely imagine that, and I mean, I know for a fact because I'm married to one that there's plenty of folk who, as soon as you say this semi-program meeting, are like, "That's great. I hope everybody who goes has a really good meeting for worship, but I'm not going because it's not my kind of thing."
Mm.
That's cool, right? I mean, it's just then it just simply becomes a practical matter of how you make sure that there's sort of space and provision. I think what I don't like is, yes, what I do have a problem with is the idea that um you can't have something that's, if anybody's saying you can't have something that's properly Quaker worship with programmed elements, with this semi-programmed. I mean, I think that I think would not be right. I mean, I'm a fan of silent worship. I sort of think that, as I say, I think it's it's one of the things that Quakers have got to offer, and there are people for whom it's the best thing ever. It's the thing they discover.
Yeah.
And fine, and therefore that needs to be there. I think what you're doing, it's for me. I know other Quaker prison chaplains who talk about very similar kind of things, and actually, the real importance of having enough structure, um, with enough, while making Quaker kinds of spaces within it.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
and it. I mean, making me think that, you know, I assume that all of the things that you've been working out are shared with other people. That there's a
Well,
conversation, a
that's
community
right. And
conversation about it. But
I'm still experimenting with it, really. One of the
mm.
things I just thought about was, and maybe you can help me understand this, is when we're talking about experiencing God within
Mm.
meeting for worship, I was thinking about inward light. So I use the term inward light, and I've
Mm.
realized that many people use the term inner light. Now, I
Mm.
feel I don't have the theological language to really explain why I don't like it, other
Okay.
than inner light feels to me very different from inward light, which comes from out there into me.
Interesting.
Do you, how, what, which of those do you use if you do? And can you explain to us what the differences between those two ideas are?
Right. I mean, this is okay. I'm going to have to decide how much to go into nitpicky scholar mode and how much to actually think about it in terms of meaningful description of people's experiences that might actually make a difference to something. Because there's a okay, so there's a line, and I'm not going to attribute it to anyone because I'm probably going to get names wrong. So, but there is a line I have seen in scholarship on early Quakerism, or on Quaker, the history of Quaker theology, if you like, that says, oh, at some point they changed from talking about, Quakers changed from talking about inward light all the time to talking about inner light, and that's when it all goes horribly wrong. That was the mistake, right? So there's a kind of narrative that says, oh, early Quakers were, it was all about inward light, and that meant that it was all about, you know, God is real. It's the same light for everyone. So the light is inward toward you, but then the sense is that it's the same light that enlightens everyone. Um, and it's not in and the problem and the narrative there goes, well, the problem with inner light is then it's sort of too individualized. It's you and your little bit of stuff, bit wandering around the world with your thing. And there's not this sense of the, like you say, the external, or I might want to say, the given, I could say objective, but it's not objective in the sense of over against you. So, but still um, uh, not just as it were yours for you, and then you do something with it if you feel like it, but something that you actually encounter, um, that you meet, that arrives at you, is an event for you, something like that. Um, I, Actually, I don't know the. I haven't been through the text enough to be able to confidently say, oh yeah, that's, there is an actual shift in Quaker theology and it actually goes wrong in that way. I quite I sort of I understand the point, and I don't know if it's close to what the sort of thing that you're thinking about, to the tension that you're seeing. I mean, I think what I'd say in defence, if you like, of the inner light kind of line is that it seems to be really important as a sort of through line in Quaker tradition and experience that um, knowledge, understanding, relation to the truth has to come from you. So to this extent, um, to believe something because you're told to believe it, to do something because you're in the name of religion because you're told to do it, to borrow the forms, if you like, to get into an empty form without the power, to use the words without meaning them. All of that is what they're. There's a real anxiety about that in Quakers, and I share that anxiety. I think that's an important anxiety. So that's why. So the emphasis on inner is partly about saying, no, you actually do have um, given to you as yours um, the capacity to know the truth about God, the capacity to understand and relate to God. That is, it's yours, and you don't need somebody else or something else to put it into you or to authenticate it for you. Actually, so that's the good bit about the inner. I think that it does actually have to be you. Um, so I think sometimes maybe the difference is not quite so strong. I mean, it's partly this sense that that in this expression about answering that of God in everyone, that I learned that what I know in me and as myself is also present in your life and for you, right? um, so so that's the 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 real encounter of the truth of God out there in the world, not just in my head. Um, but then a lot of that is actually going to come through the encounter with other people, right? It kind of comes in community. Uh, so that's maybe the sort of, if I put it this way, the mediating space between the inward, like, well, it is actually something real that's there even when you're not, and even when you're not paying attention, and true whether you like it or not, and all of that,
Yeah.
and you actually can come to knowledge of it for yourself, and you will come to knowledge of it for yourself if you give it time and space. That's the inner bit. But then maybe the middle bit is this idea that, and the way that the way you figure out, if you like, that it's not just kind of going on in your own head, is often this encounter with other people, this community.
In which of those two ways would you say you experience the light? Do you experience it as inward or just inner?
Uh, well, I I think it's um just trying to think about that. No, I mean, actually, the experience of is I would say in the mode I talked about as inward, and that's kind of really important because I mean, there's something enormously important about believing in a God that doesn't need to be believed in. Yeah.
Mm.
So, like, you can do what the heck you like. God is still there. You can forget about it. You can stop believing. You can go off. It is still real. And that's, I guess, that, and then, the idea that the reality of God is somehow connected to, you know, random things that come into my head, or things that come into my head or heart or mind is that's the next stage, if you like.
Well,
That's the bonus. The ocean of light is first, right? It's
yeah.
just there. It's just there, whether you can see it or not, even. Yeah.
And but I suppose the way that I think about it, and maybe this is just judgmental and maybe it's just wrong, but I think this is true. And that is that if you first of all recognize that there's an ocean of light outside of yourself and you don't
Yeah.
feel connected to it, well, that's just a bit of a sad thing. And I'm sure, I would say I hope you will one day experience the light. And then for people who
Yeah.
experience the inner light, but it's not connected to anything else, I also think that's a little bit sad. And I hope for you one day that you will experience that this is something out there that is reaching into you. So for
Yeah,
me,
that makes sense.
the inner light is always an earlier stage, if you like, and that
Uh,
once you've experienced it as inward, you will be forever transformed by that experience.
yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just maybe using the categories in a slightly different way from you because I don't really disagree with anything you just said.
Mm.
So,
Well, the reason I think this is important to talk about is because in Quakers, I find that when people want to learn more about um, theology or spiritual journeys or Quaker experience of God, Quaker's experience of the Holy Spirit, we don't talk about it very much in these ways. We might refer someone to the library or to a book. We might say, go and talk to that person over there. But we often don't spell this out, and we certainly don't teach it as this is a path that you can expect to go on, and this is a journey that you could open yourself up to that will be powerful and empowering and enlightening and make your life easy. My yoke is easy. Um,
mm, mm,
and we
mm,
don't do that
mm.
at all. And I wonder sometimes whether that's really an abdication of our responsibility. Those of us in the second half of our lives, if we put ourselves in that kind of the older generations category, I think we have a responsibility to newcomers and to younger people to say, well, this is the journey I've been on, and this is what you can experience directly for yourself. And that I is how I read the message of the early Quakers and what George Fox.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's right. Do I think that's right? Yes. I mean, the idea that actually it's really important to provide points of access for learning and learning from others' experience, not this is the rules, but this is you had a nice way of putting it a minute ago. This is the journey I've been on, and this is a journey that you could something like that.
Hmm.
I mean that seems really important. Whether everybody has to do it all the time, I don't know. I mean, I know Quakers who are really, really good at that kind of teaching ministry, and it's the more sort of airtime they get, the better, as far as I'm concerned. And the more people get access to what they're doing, the better. And it is. I mean, I suppose we could put it this way: it's the big risk that we run by not paying anybody to be a minister, right? And I'm all in favour of not paying anybody to be a minister, but what you have to recognise that the big gap you open up is the teaching ministry, is the, and not so much the sort of persuade people to come through the door the first time, but the uh, space in which folk just encounter and get used to some of what Quakers have learned over the centuries, basically, and then some of what they're drawing from what everybody else has learned over even more centuries. Um, Not in a this is what you have to memorize kind of way, but very much again, as you say, this is testimony, right? Testimony in the sense of, well, I'm a witness. I've been there, so I'm going to report to you. This is what the experience is. We need to be making sure that we're sharing testimony in that kind of way. Um, and that, yeah, I mean, it's a structural risk, right? And Quakers had, I guess, different ways of getting around it in the past.
Would you agree we're not quite getting it right at the moment?
Well, I think I don't like to generalise. I think there are meetings where there's loads of good stuff going on, and almost certainly meetings where there aren't. So I'm quite. I'm also really, really, something that I've think one of the things about growing up about Quakers is that there are things that just annoy you all the time about Quakers, and are always going to annoy you all the time about Quakers, and they're never going to make you leave, but are always going to annoy you all the time about Quakers. One of the things that will annoy me all the time about Quakers is that Quakers are the best people in the world at saying Quakers aren't good enough, and this, that, or the other, and Quakers aren't doing enough, and Quakers need to do more, work harder, be better, so on and so forth.
But we do
Ooh.
have a central staff. We do have committees and central, organizing bodies that who are asked to discern a way forward on this work. So I think there are ways in which these ideas can gather momentum and genuinely change things in the centre, can't they? I think that
I
is
don't,
one
yeah,
of the
yeah. I
potential.
mean, I'm not saying nobody should ever say, "Oh, things could be done differently," or so on and so forth. It's just, um, I would love the answer sometimes to be, we can do less of this thing, because actually, Quakers as a group have been shrinking in Britain, and this is not a problem limited to Quakers, very much not a problem limited to Quakers. It's something you see across all the mainstream churches, because I had the same conversations, lots and lots of different places. Um, it's really, really hard not to think, oh, this is a thing that the fewer and fewer of us who are left can fix if we work harder. And
Well,
maybe
let me
not.
tell you my idea, right? I think the thing that we should be doing less of is this um, progressive politics, a message for every problem in the world, some kind of statement from the centre about a war here and a war there. Much less of that, much less politics, and coming back to really emphasizing religion. And bearing in mind the conversation we've just had, what really concerns me is that we privilege and listen to the voices of anybody who's got opinions on such matters, whether or not they can show the spiritual journey that's got them to that place. And I think we're very open then as a society of friends because we don't have these structures that we're listening to far more politics than spiritual guidance and support and nurture. And that I remember after 5 years of being a Quaker, so this was like 10, 15 years ago now, thinking, well, I have got spiritual questions, and my spiritual community is finding it difficult to give me some support with that. But they've got all the answers in the world about the politics, about the ways to do good in the world, the faith into action, the charity support, etc. But they can't help me with the spiritual questions I have. And that really struck me. And you know how Facebook kind of throws up a post from 10 years ago. And it threw up a post that I put onto one of the Facebook groups 10 years ago, which was exactly this point. And I thought, I'm still saying the same thing today.
Mm.
What do you make of that?
Oh goodness. I mean, I bristle a lot, obviously, as you'd expect, as somebody who grew up Quaker, as at a sort of, well, the religion here and the politics here, because actually, so here's where I think, where I find Quakers most inspiring. Some of the places I find Quakers most inspiring, where I feel I learn most from other Quakers, and I feel like, yeah, this is my community doing its thing, is actually the point where those two meet perfectly. So I'll give you an example. This There's been some really good work done both in the UK, come from the US, and there was a talk about it at yearly meeting, and then British Quakers doing some now, applying the work on the approaches of quiet diplomacy that were used in Northern Ireland peace process in former Yugoslavia and so on to intractable conflicts in domestic political situations. So Quakers history, which is really deeply spiritually grounded, actually grounded in the sorts of spiritual practices we've been talking about. These open-ended listening, which is not about saying there's no truth, but about saying at the moment we've got a lot of things that we can see and they don't fit together. This kind of reflecting on conflict, this making space, this valuing everyone, this expecting the possibility of change, expecting the possibility of transformation. All of that brings all of that spiritual activity into practices that are political, right? I mean, but and you can see that happening. I mean, say particularly Quaker peace building work, Quaker work in prisons. You know, a whole range of Quaker political activities that are really deeply inspired, not even so much necessarily by a belief, right, but by a way of looking at the world, a way of doing things. Now, I think what I've done there is I've slightly deflated, derailed your question because I've talked about activities rather than about statements, and your question came in about statements. And I do think that's when to make a statement and how to make a statement is. There have been Quaker statements made when I've gone, you know, like you do when somebody ministers at the end of meeting for worship. That was well left before, as in Quakers didn't actually need to go and say something about that. Like we didn't really add anything to all the other people that are saying things. That happens sometimes, and sometimes I think no, actually, there is a point here because we are a community with specific tradition and history who, if you like, have earned the right or have um, can get a certain kind of hearing or recognition because we've put the yards in over the years in work in this area. So actually, that's worth
Yeah.
doing.
But,
Um,
but can you see how I can, from my perspective, sometimes I'm not entirely convinced that God is in there.
I
Because
mean,
by the time it's gone from somebody who's part of this social milieu, part of this culture, who then can see the tradition, can see the history, can see everybody else, and has got their own political opinions, how do we know that those actions have still got God at their centre? And I'm not entirely convinced by that anymore. And I do see that there's a little bit of a divorce, you know, um, that kind of, trunk and trailer effect, where the kind of the engine goes on, and actually it's a little bit divorced from the deep spiritual center, and that people find that difficult to articulate as well. And I think once you find that difficult to explain where God is in that, I think you start to get into tricky territory and potentially misguided, and they're not really testimonies. They've become simply a political activity that's running away with itself. And I
okay.
suppose this only
Mm,
becomes apparent to us as individuals when there's something that we disagree with.
yeah. Well,
And then once you
I
begin
don't know.
to see
I'm
something that
not sure
you
actually.
disagree with, and you think, well, hold on a second, I don't feel that that is a deeply spiritual, grounded activity or political statement or direction of travel, and you're not actually coming back to where God is, then it starts to really become apparent to you. But for the whole time that you agree with 100% everything that
Mm,
Quaker belief is, this kind of
mm,
package of political opinion, which at the moment is very progressive politics.
Mm,
Once you start to think, well, actually, that's not my opinions, like, for example, a Brexit supporter, let's just say, as an
mm,
example.
mm, mm, mm.
Once that happened 5 years ago, I think that that starts to put a chink of light, perhaps between, a gap opens up between what this central block of political ideas are, which everybody assumes they're still connected to a deep spiritual grounding. And I'm just not so sure anymore. And the more I see it, the more I see it.
I see what you mean, I think. I can think of a few ways to think about it. So, I mean, on the question about whether it only happens when you disagree with something, I mean, I have actually been in Quaker business meetings that decided to sort of make minutes or statements about a thing that was basically in the Guardian, and everybody who read the Guardian thought this thing was terrible or whatever. You know what I mean? A sort of
Yeah.
like the thing that all your left wing friends all agree with at once, and they tried to make a minute like that. And I've gone, well, that wasn't actually a. I didn't feel that as a Quaker discernment process, right? Everybody came in the room agreeing, so obviously they could all agree a minute, you know. And I might agree with it or not, but you know, so but I don't see that as a sort of failure of Quakerism as a whole. I see that as, you know, a bunch of Quakers who maybe were actually almost too fast led by the fact that they happened to come from a very homogenous class and political background into thinking, into short circuiting a process, right? And that is a thing that can happen, right? And I actually also don't think you have to be the lone voice in the room to notice it happening. It's a risk in Quaker business process because of the, you know, to get technical about it, or not technical, but you know, consensus can look very like sense of the meeting, but they ain't the same thing. And you know, knowing whether you've got sense of the meeting. And I would also add probably that I think that the sort of consensusy type thing is more likely to happen if you've got folk that, for whatever reason, don't really take the Quaker business process seriously, which, you know, might happen for various reasons, and then it's just a sort of, oh, okay, this is a minute to agree what we all think about such a thing, which is not right. I mean, it's really not. And I could imagine that being replicated at larger scale, right? And that is what I would then mean by having lost touch with a spiritual centre. Um, I think, what else am I prepared to say? I think that um, it is the case. I certainly hear Quakers taking really shortcuts on the the things that get called the four testimonies, which I have a massive problem with the way they get used, and taking a shortcut on, oh well, obviously Quakers believe in, I don't know, uh, you know, truth, therefore they think you should read this newspaper and not that one, or something like this one, because this one tells more truth. Yeah, that's not a real example, but you can get the kind of thing. Um, so because I think once you're working from a list of things that start to look like values, um, then it's much more open to a kind of self self-pleasing manipulation, if you like, then, which I do as much as anybody else, to say, oh well, it has to be in line with truth, and so obviously what I think is truth, so it's in line with that, you know, and take out the stage when you do the discernment, when you do the spiritual discernment. Um, my answer, I realise, has been a lot about process and not so much about content. But that's because I actually do tend to think that the process is the thing. I mean, another thing I'll say is that the whole, oh, we're getting too political and not spiritual enough. Rhiannon Grant and I did a piece of work I really, really enjoyed. It was so much fun on the foundations of a true social order. So the big, really fascinating political, although theologically grounded, statement that Quakers made in 1918, that yearly meeting put through in 1918, and I think kind of put it through without reading it properly, and it's really left wing radical. And then the bunch of friends that have drafted it spent 20 years, basically trying to persuade the yearly meeting to go all the way with this statement they'd done, and a whole lot of other people looked, sort of stood back, took a look at it, and went, "We did what?" um, so
Right.
it's a
Well,
very interesting.
we've been
There were
doing the
quite a lot of
same.
these interesting little case studies in these sorts of tensions between, oh, we've got too political and not religious enough, oh, we haven't done proper discernment on the statement. They actually have kept coming round, which isn't a reason you need to take them seriously every time they come round, I think.
Well, I suppose this is why I think, our main, we do have to cut back on things, as you said. I mean, we are slightly shrinking. We have to kind of cut back on some of the things that we do. And I just wish that what we were doing was cutting back on um, some of these outward projects, which I'm not so convinced that we have the deep spiritual grounding anymore right now. I think we've become fairly superficial across the piece. Obviously, you get different meetings with different flavors, if you like, different styles. But we've become a political campaigning organization to a ridiculous extent. Now, I don't know. I mean, if you're saying we have historical precedent for that, in a way, that's even worse because we should be more prepared for it now each time it comes around.
I mean, I think the thing is that I don't fully recognise what you're describing. I mean, that's not what I see as Quakers in. That's not how I see Quakers in Britain right now. Uh, I There are specific, I have specific experiences, or there are specific points when I think actually, you've just sort of said something's just been said as a decision of Quakers that hasn't been discerned fully within Quakers to the extent that I need it to be in order to be able to really accept that that's what being led to do. I've seen that happen at, local, regional, national level. But as a general problem, I don't always see. I actually see some ways, at least some of the time, the opposite. I see Quakers who are people who are, first political animals, if you like, and social change animals and so on, coming to Quakers and thinking this is where I actually need my spiritual guidance and my spiritual centre, as a way and the community and valuing the community precisely because it's not just another political movement. But I think it's quite varied. So I mean, the historical story, if you like, is partly to say, what you're describing is something that happens. I'm personally not, on the basis of my experience, I don't see that that's what's kind of happening to everyone all the time. I think.
Well,
I mean, if I had to do the sort of I don't know what I'd do for the um, what are we going to do less of other than worrying, which would generally
well,
always
we
be a
do a
good
lot of
idea.
worry, and I think perfect love casts out fear, and you would think we've got an awful lot of fear and not much perfect love. That's one of the things that bothers me a little bit, and I
Um,
think probably
I
what
think
would I
that's
stop? I would stop a huge amount of it. I think we need
okay.
to cut
Okay.
back radically. A lot of the outward work that we do, because it's a little bit coincidental, isn't it, that the Guardian you've just mentioned, all of the political projects which we have underway would be very much supported by the wider Guardian readership. So it's a little bit coincidental, if you know what
Yeah.
I mean. But we have a
I'm not.
discerned
Yeah. I
position,
think.
but it's
Yeah.
just the
Yeah.
same as all the other Guardian readers.
I mean, I don't. And I get. I mean, I think the picture's a bit more complex than that because I think that even when Quakers are working on things that other people are bothered about, um, can add value by working in Quaker ways, and that is really important. The work that I do for Quakers out with occasionally hanging out with the kids and trying to revise the Book of Discipline is World Council of Churches work, is ecumenical work. I mean, there's the stuff that Quakers are doing that doesn't get anywhere near the Guardian and doesn't get anywhere near Quake. I mean, there's actually quite a diversity of Quaker activity at local levels as well. So I I don't know. And I think the other thing about talking about outward work is that okay, one of my funny experiences of kind of being that annoying pedantic Quaker was when at some point Written Yearly Meeting redid its website and it had us, somewhere on the sort of introduction to Quakers, it has a thing that says, you know, what is it? Something like Quakers are not interested in trying to persuade people to share their beliefs or worship or something. That's never been what we've been about. And I sent a little email saying if that had never been what we've been about, there wouldn't be any Quakers. So actually, mission, what most churches would call mission, is pretty core to Quakers, in my view, because that's about saying, firstly, that literally everybody, and really, really importantly, everybody can experience the presence of God in their lives and it can transform their lives. And actually, that's something that connects us potentially with absolutely everybody. And we've also got a really good idea that the way to get that people is not to go and shout at them about it, but to behave in ways and act in ways and relate to them in ways that encourage them to explore these possibilities that are given to them within their own lives, and that does actually require outward connection, right?
Yeah.
Like you say, I mean, the teaching ministry is part of it, but also, I mean, things like your work in prisons. That's a wonderful example, right? That's based on that kind of conviction. Yes, all of these people are basically in the same place as me.
Mm.
Um,
And
Absolutely crucial.
thank
Yeah.
you for that focus on the word mission because I think that is really helpful. Um, and I know from my
Because that's really
oh,
scary. I mean, I would never talk in those terms to Quakers. I talk about outreach, but it's the same thing. I mean, and the good thing about talking about mission is that it also encompasses social action of whatever kind, right? So it's the work that you're sent to do. Yeah. Yeah.
yes, but I mean, I think mission is really clarifying because many people are familiar with the term in their organizational lives because,
I see
all
mission like that.
charities
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
organizations will have a mission and some kind of vision statement of what that means. So and I think, one of the things that I know from organizational studies that if you can get the culture of your organization such that everybody understands the mission, you're in a very clear place because of everything they do, they can see that it's with this purpose in mind. And I suppose that might be a useful way of explaining what my concern is, that I don't feel that Quakers often at the moment focus on this mission. I don't think you could talk to some Quakers and not get this sense of a direct experience of God. But
yeah.
that's not something that we talk about very much anymore.
It's quite interesting. I was just thinking about because I think the way I use the word mission is a bit different from that. Um, and I understand what you're saying, and I think it is part of the picture. I think the thing that I'd want to add is that mission, in the sense in which I'm using it, has got this open-endedness about it that an organisational mission often doesn't have, right? I mean, you know, I suppose you can make it the same, but mission in the sort of sense I'm using it is it's about being sent, right? So it's you being turned outwards into the world and into relation, and the reason that what makes that possible is this conviction based on experience that when you go out, you find God in everyone waiting to meet you. Right? That's the what makes what shapes the mission, what makes it work as it does, what makes you behave as you do. What means that you think it's worth trying to engage in a conversation and present the truth even to somebody who looks like they're not remotely interested in truth or anything like that. This there's some really basic stuff, kind of key stuff about Quaker kind of practice and approach individually and collectively that. So I suppose maybe it is like an organisational mission. It's just that sometimes I think an organisational mission may sometimes be about identifying and securing the future of the organisation. And I think the other thing that is useful about believing in God, I find, is that actually at the point where God doesn't need Quakers to exist anymore, Quakers won't exist anymore, and that will be fine.
Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely. Surely.
and that's actually quite important to me, um, and really quite liberating, and maybe one of the reasons why I'm, one of my things we need to do less is worry. Um,
Yes.
Actually, it would be obviously I'd be absolutely devastated if I thought there weren't going to be Quakers anymore in a few years' time. But well, there's not going to be me anymore in 10 something years time, and God will still exist, so that's all right. In a way, things have their time, right? They have their time.
Exactly.
They have
Absolutely.
they're
Absolutely.
there as long as they need to be. You just a very good friend of mine, who's a leader in the United Reformed Church, has written some really profound reflections on the death of churches. In this case, the death of church communities in a community that's also experiencing very fast decline. And in this sense of engaging, well, that sometimes the thing that you are called to do next is die.
Mm.
I mean, he's talking about local churches, local communities, and how they deal with that. Um, and from experience of pastoral, it's a minister as well, so from experience of pastoral work with people who are dying and thinking about how communities do that. I
Mm.
mean, and obviously that is a thing that happens with Quaker meetings individually, and it may be also with aspects of Quaker work or life. I mean, it doesn't look that way to me right now for Quakers as a whole, but that's maybe because I'm part of a meeting which is flourishing and it's got huge numbers of people and new people all the time and real sense of energy and it's issues of various kinds, but nothing that looks like it's going to prove terminal. Do you see what I mean? So that's not where I feel with Quakers right now, but it's worth having in the back of one's mind, I find.
Yes.
Um, uh,
So
yeah,
that brings us very nicely to the final question then about what are your hopes for the future? I mean, you've talked a bit about, what God wants, God will make happen. But what are your hopes for how Quakers develop in the future?
I what do I mean, I really, I hope very deeply that the young adults whom I now see coming to my meeting and who I hear are coming to other, maybe particularly to city centre meetings, find in the experience of Quaker worship in Quaker communities something of what they need in order to navigate an increasingly challenging and chaotic world. So I suppose I have this hope that all of these centuries of Quaker spirituality and tradition can do their bit towards getting, let's say, the UK or the world or whatever, through what comes next. And then you think, well, did the First World War, there are actually, there's historical precedent is also quite useful. I mean, we did the whole bit in the 1660s when we were illegal and sort of got through all of that. That doesn't strike me as a sort of outlandish hope. I think to realise that hope, to make it to make that hope real, we probably do need a bit more of what you're saying, a bit more of the teaching ministry. We need ways of making available some of that wider and deeper treasury of Quaker experience, because there's so much that can speak to the needs of today. There's just so much,
Mm.
and I'd love to feel that that could be taken up if I could do something with it. So that's not about numbers. It's about how what Quaker communities sort of playing their part, if you like, in this bigger ecosystem. Um, and because I kind of come back to, well, we have got these things that we've learned over time. We've got the way of worship. We've got this sense of the direct experience of God. We've got this confidence in the possibility of the experience of God and transformation of life in the other. And we've got these ways of thinking and living with conflict and difference, and there's so much. Um, but I don't. It's not that, oh, that's got to carry on exactly the same. I just hope that it comes to life in the way it needs to
Yeah,
at
yeah.
this time.
And and just to finish then, you did mention you were on the Book of Discipline.
Yeah.
So how does that fit into the future? And how, do you want to say anything about how that's
Um.
shaping up?
Um. I. I
Or
mean.
just generally how that feeds into the future, the next generation of Quakers, if you like?
I mean, what it's been a lot of fun to do. I'm I think what I'm excited about with it is the idea that um, we I don't know if it does this to the next generation. We've tried to be much more explicit than previous books of disciplines have been about the spiritual grounding of what Quakers do. I mean, because there's a lot that the current book of discipline just doesn't really make explicit or spell out, why things are. Actually, a lot of it, the stuff that I ended up working on most is about process and structures, because the existing books of discipline have tended to just say this is how we do things. Da, 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 da. Um, this is no good in a context that's not only sort of not raised Quaker but also unchurched, if you like. So kind of doesn't have the frame of any sort of a frame of reference. So we're actually doing much more that's about first principles, if you like. And I think, so my big vision about it is that that's actually much more liberating and freeing, because then you start to say, well, okay, it doesn't actually matter if you don't sign the minutes of the meeting or whatever. Or maybe there are some forms of innovation that you can do and then others that you actually can't, right? It'd be a big deal if we say we take a vote. It's not a big deal if you don't sign the minutes of the meeting. How do I know that? Well, actually, I've thought about how this practice is a reflection of core Quaker spiritual principles, if you like, informed by our experience. And so I see that actually as future proofing, because what it's do it this sense that if you're grounded, if you have your core, if you have your center, then you can actually respond more easily to what comes. And so what I love the Book of Discipline is to do that, really, is to give say I'm aware of it particularly in relationship to the structures, but to give that sense of grounded core that will enable um, response to what comes next. But the book can't do that. I mean, the other thing is that the
No.
book doesn't do that. We don't do this kind of thing through books. It's that the people, the communities have to do that,
Yes.
or have to, yes, yeah, they have to live that. The life has to come first. Um, so, but then the book you hope would enable, would inspire, would
Yeah.
try and make that possible, and it's about, yeah, really not getting stuck in forms. I mean, one of the lines I like best from the 17th century Quaker ways of talking about things is about getting into it. I mean, it's biblical. It's a biblical line. It's what's good is the way they use it. Getting into a form without the power. Um, and I mean, they talk about it in the first place about, this is why we don't like going to church or whatever. This form without the power. But then you can actually, see it comes around. It's a risk for Quakers also. So it's
Absolutely.
what Margaret Fell talks
Absolutely.
about in a different kind of way towards the end of her life, when she's saying everybody's getting too hung up on what the young people wear. That's not the point. Um, so I'm trying, and goodness, I'm more Lutheran than I thought I was, because it's also kind of the law gospel distinction, and not quite, but um, there's something about trying to do Quaker writing, including the Book of Discipline, and communicate Quakerism in such a way that it enables folk to recognize the risk of getting into a form without the power, but also to recognize other side of it, that there is a power to be found, right? That um, you can take the risk if you like. You can take the risk, and it'll be all right. Um,
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's really good to hear you talk about that. And I think that phrase sums up my concerns as well, that as you
okay.
say, we have become form without power. So I think that's a very helpful way to think about it. And I must admit, what you've just said about what you see as coming through in the new book around coming back to our spiritual roots and the grounding of where we find the power for our work and our ongoing structures and processes. That's given me a lot of hope, actually. Because I've been a bit worried, if I'm honest, that it's moving in an atheist direction and it's you know um, becoming more political and it we're not getting as much information out of the Book of Discipline process as I might like, I suppose. Perhaps I need to go searching for it more.
No, I mean, you know what is, yes, okay. That I mean, that's this is stuff that's constantly under discussion. Is oh, we can't show people the text because then they'll decide that that's how the text's going to be, and they'll get all cross about it in advance. But then actually, if we don't show them, then they start all sorts of conspiracy theories come up. There's just always a push pull on that. But we'll see what you think. I mean, it's I've given you my line. I think certainly in terms of the way to think about, if you like, the church government material, what I've just described, this is absolute. This is a principle of our way of work. This is something we've set for ourselves as a way of working, um, and then that that should also be seen to come through in the other chapters, the other sections, and we'll see how it all goes.
I
I
hope
mean,
so. I hope so. I think it's a really important message that you've just said there, and I hope that that's reflective throughout the whole book, not just the sections that you're working on.
I mean, I think, and as I say, obviously, I'm not speaking for the committee. I'm a member of the committee. I'm talking about what's important to me and what I think I've actually found really exciting about the process. I mean, and there is stuff that, sorry, this is nerdy, but there is stuff that really, as far as I can make out, nobody's actually ever written down before, and we all sort of know. I mean, some of that's on the structure side, like things about, well, how does yearly meeting relate to area meetings, relate to local meetings and stuff? I mean, not how in terms of practice, oh, they send minutes to, but theologically, what's going on there? What kind of claims are we making about authority and membership and so on and so on? So there's some there's been some really interesting thinking to do, and that I've enjoyed.
Well,
Uh,
I'm a great believer in, you can't do everything by a great big committee of thousands of people looking at everything. You do, in the end, have to just go with what that small group are trusted to take forward. So I look forward to
yeah,
seeing more of the output, really, and
yeah,
taking it in the round.
yeah, I think it's push pull. I mean, because there does have to be, in the end, it's got to be yearly meetings, but not our book, and that's something we've also always been clear about as a committee. And actually, one of the things we've been talking about quite a bit, links to other things you and I have said about, is about the point at which you let go and you say, well, okay, whatever happens to this happens to this. I did my thing. Now I need to stop trying to control it.
Yes.
And you have that within a committee because you have a small group of people work on a text and then they give it to the committee and the committee say or something. And then that has to be handled. But then that to the max when you say to yearly meeting. But um, I actually have a lot of confidence of various kinds in collectively, Quakers being able to pull this off, as in being able to think through together and accept a book of discipline. I mean, if we can't, we've got a bit of a problem.
Well,
Um,
indeed.
but because that suggests various things about the sort of stuff you've been talking about, failures of teaching and, people not being in much more different places than they thought they were, or having joined something that they didn't know what they'd joined and so on. So there are risks there, but I still have a reasonable amount of confidence in the thing. Maybe I'm just naturally optimistic, but
No, that's great. No, it's been really good to hear you talk all that through. And it's given me more confidence actually. So thank you very much. And so thank you for your time today. Let's
oh, thank you.
let's bring it to a close. Thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Great to talk. Good. You
Thank you.